Captain Edward Smith. Does the captain really go down with the ship? One of the most infamous Titanic photos was taken on board the vessel shortly before the ship crashed. The picture shows Captain E.J. Smith standing outside a series of windows. At this point in time, the captain had no idea of the horror that was to come. The mystery of Captain Smith is that nobody knows what he was doing at the time the Titanic sank. His final moments have been a mystery ever since that fateful night on April 14, 1912. At approximately 11:40 p.m., the ship struck an iceberg. Witnesses say the captain appeared on the bridge of the Titanic several moments later. He asked what the ship struck, to which First Officer William Murdoch replied, "An iceberg, sir." Captain Edward Smith had spent 40 years at sea before taking the Titanic on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic. In all those years, he had hardly been involved in an accident and had certainly never been accountable for one. But at 11:40 p.m., he was suddenly the man responsible for the deaths of 1,500 passengers and crew. His own name would soon be among the dead. The body of the captain was never found, and it still remains unknown what he did in the last few minutes before the ship sank. But there are a lot of contradictory accounts. One witness said they saw Captain Smith leap off the ship holding a baby. According to author Wynne Craig Wade, who wrote a book on the subject, the captain is said to have died in at least 5 different ways. At roughly midnight, Titanic head designer Thomas Andrews told Captain Smith the boat had between 60 and 90 minutes left before it sank. Smith knew the ship was doomed. At 12:05 a.m., he gave orders to uncover the lifeboats and alert the passengers. He also told the wireless operators to transmit a distress signal. At 12:45 a.m., Smith ordered the distress rockets to be fired in case there was a passing ship. About an hour later, near 2 o'clock a.m., Smith released the wireless operators, telling them to save themselves. 20 minutes later, the Titanic was gone. Several witnesses claimed they saw the captain in the water. Titanic fireman Harry Sr. said the captain jumped off the boat with a baby. He swam to a lifeboat, handed the baby away, and then swam back toward the sinking ship. One rumor is that he got into a lifeboat that flipped over, so he drowned. Another eyewitness claimed they saw the captain get swept off the deck by a wave. There are also some weird reports that the captain survived. In July 1912, Peter Pryall from Baltimore allegedly saw Smith walking down a city street. In 1940, Life magazine ran a story saying Captain Smith died in Lima, Ohio. Many believe the captain did get into a lifeboat, then secretly escaped so that he wouldn't have to face the shame of being the man responsible for the Titanic's destruction. And now it's shout-out time! I want to give a big thank you to Tom and his truck and Gavin Knight for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Lifeboat Inspectors. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, 2,200 people chaotically scrambled for survival. 700 people managed to get away in lifeboats, leaving over 1,500 to go down with the sinking Titanic. But did you know that the reason for the extremely high death toll was the lack of lifeboats? Did you also know that as people were finally pulled to safety, many of the lifeboats were only partially filled? What really happened wasn't like in the movie Titanic with overflowing lifeboats. Many only had a few people in them. People had gotten in the boats and escaped as quickly as possible to save their own skin. Knowing these facts is what makes this next picture so shocking. The photograph was taken before the Titanic set sail, showing the lifeboat inspector checking flotation devices. This was the person who checked the lifeboats and gave the go-ahead for the ship to leave, even though there weren't enough to accommodate the passengers on the ship. In 2012, a new document emerged that stirred up the old ghosts of the Titanic. The document contained the handwritten notes of Safety Inspector Maurice Clark. He urged 10 additional lifeboats to be added to the ship just 5 hours before the ship set sail. However, the owner of the ship wanted to be on time. He didn't want to waste precious minutes adding lifeboats to the unsinkable vessel, but if the owner had delayed just a little bit and gotten those lifeboats, experts say 700 more people may have survived. The only silver lining in the lifeboat disaster is that following the sinking of the Titanic, regulations were changed. From this moment onward, in many countries, all ships were required to have enough lifeboats to save every person on board. The treacherous iceberg. On the morning of April 15th, after the Titanic had already sunk, a man on board the ship, Prince Adalbert, snapped a photograph. Chief steward of the liner took a picture of an iceberg. The steward didn't know what happened to the Titanic. All he knew was that the iceberg looked highly unusual. There was a smear of red paint along the base of it. The paint looked like it had rubbed off the hull of a ship during a collision, kind of like how paint from a car is transferred during an accident. The steward didn't realize he may have been taking a picture of the very thing that killed 1,500 people and destroyed the unsinkable ship. There's no way of saying for sure if the iceberg was the one that killed the Titanic. Some have speculated that the Titanic would have obliterated the iceberg it hit, leaving nothing recognizable. But then how did the experts account for the red smear on the side of the chunk of ice? Well, the truth is that icebergs aren't always white as snow. Sometimes they have brownish layers to them, looking kind of dirty. This may have just been a dirty iceberg. Still, it was taken in the same place where the Titanic sank, so it could be the real deal. Marks of fire. There are a lot of bizarre theories surrounding how the Titanic sank, with many people suggesting more was involved than just an iceberg. One of the most popular theories is that the Titanic was on fire for days before it hit the iceberg, and that the fire caused the ship to be weakened. It may just be a theory, but it's a theory with pictures to back it up. There are photographs of the ship taken by Chief Electrical Engineer John Kempster. Descendants of John recovered the photos from their attic where they had been hiding for 100 years. They brought the pictures to an auction house in 2012 to cash in on the history. In two of the photos, there are very clear dark markings on the starboard side of the Titanic. The markings are about 30 feet long on the exterior of the ship's 6th boiler room. The boiler room is rumored to have been on fire for several days. It just so happens that those dark markings, potentially evidence of hull damage, were exactly where the ship hit the iceberg. Experts think the fire damage could have weakened the structure, allowing the iceberg to rip open the vessel. There is some truth to the rumor. The day before the Titanic departed from Belfast, a fire was detected in one of the coal storage bunkers. News of the fire was glossed over during the inquiry after the sinking of the ship. Firemen on board were supposedly told to keep their mouths shut, but after the disaster, John Dilly couldn't stay quiet. John was a fireman aboard the ship who said the day the Titanic set sail, it was on fire. The fire supposedly raged while at sea, with temperatures of over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. If true, as the pictures seem to indicate, the fire likely made the steel brittle. The flames would have directly resulted in every single death on the Titanic. Bernice Palmer's Kodak Brownie. Around the time Bernice Palmer turned 17, she received a new Kodak Brownie box camera. She brought that camera with her when she boarded the Carpathia, the ship that was responsible for rescuing the survivors of the Titanic. Early in the morning on April 15th, Captain Rostron of the Carpathia was awakened by his wireless operator. They had received the distress call from the rapidly sinking Titanic. The captain immediately changed course, hoping to quickly close the 60 miles between the Carpathia and the Titanic. They passed 6 icebergs and finally arrived at the wreckage at 4 o'clock in the morning. Thus began the terrible business of picking up survivors among the floating bodies. Bernice photographed everything she could using her box camera. Some of the most iconic photographs taken after the disaster were from a curious 17-year-old girl. Bernice later recounted how the faces of the survivors looked frozen and terrified. She and her mother stood on deck as passengers were lifted up from the lifeboats, and with her camera, she snapped a whole slew of photographs of them. There happened to be a newsman from Underwood & Underwood, a photography agency based in New York, on board the Carpathia. Bernice approached the newsman and he agreed to buy her photos for $10. 5 of these photos were later released by the agency, though it's unclear exactly how much money Bernice got. It's been said her father was furious later on when he realized how much money they could have made if his daughter had just waited. Bernice truly had the best photographs of the Titanic's aftermath. The Mummy and the Aliens. You've heard the theory about the fire that helped destroy the Titanic, and you've also seen the pictures that go with it. But there are other shocking conspiracy theories you might be interested in that aren't backed up by photographs. For example, there's a popular rumor that the ship sank because it was cursed by an ancient mummy. Not a mummy exactly, but a painted wooden mummy board that was placed on the inside of a coffin lid about 3,000 years ago. The painted image on the mummy board shows a woman with her fingers extended. Although nobody knows her exact identity, today. She's been called the priestess of Amun-Ra. The mummy board was found in the ancient ruins of Thebes, where the woman likely acted as a priestess. The artifact has been blamed for a variety of deaths and disasters. It's said that after Bertram Fletcher Robinson conducted research into the history of the artifact, he became convinced it held evil powers. Shortly after his investigation began, Bertram died suddenly at the age of 36. One of the rumors is that the mummy board was being moved from the British Museum to New York on the Titanic when it sank. There isn't any proof that the artifact was on board the Titanic. It also wouldn't make sense since the painted artifact is currently stored at the British Museum in London. Unless somebody secretly pulled it out of the water and brought it back with them, the mummy board would likely be at the bottom of the ocean right now had it been on board. When the Titanic's log was discovered in 1985, researchers didn't find any mention of a mummy or mummy-related relics. In 2012, Dr. Joseph Hostetler put forth his own strange idea about why the Titanic sank. He claimed that large holes discovered underneath the hull of the ship were made by lasers. He claimed the lasers that burned holes in the bottom of the Titanic were fired by an underwater alien craft. But just like with the mummy rumors, there isn't any proof that aliens sunk the Titanic. The wreck 100 years later. The Titanic has been sitting at the bottom of the sea for over 110 years. Still, new discoveries are being made down in its watery grave all the time. It took over 70 years for researchers to find the Titanic, lost at the bottom of the sea 350 miles from the coast of Newfoundland. Just this year, researchers revealed for the first time a full digital scan of the ship. Other photos and videos were taken of the site when divers found it in 1985, but they were murky at best. This was the first time a 3D scan showed the entire boat in all its wrecked glory. The scans are cool because they've created a detailed image of the rusting ship partially buried at the bottom of the sea. But there are other haunting photos that were taken early during submarine expeditions. Photos from 2003 show the ghostly ruins of the dining room and a decaying anchor. In 2004, a picture was taken of the remains of a coat and some boots buried near the stern, looking like there may have once been a body inside. The newspapers. When word reached America that the Titanic was sinking, nobody believed it. Just take a look at this headline from The World, a Vancouver newspaper that printed the story on April 15, 1912. The headline reads, "Titanic sinking, no lives lost." As everybody knows now, that was clearly not the case. The Daily Province ran a similar headline on the same day, which read, "Titanic sinking, but probably no lives will be lost." The Vancouver Sun, a newspaper that's still around today, was only 2 months old at the time of the disaster. They tried to print a paper with straight facts rather than speculating, but their story said that 1,300 people were on the ship when there were really over 2,200. The World claimed the Titanic was still afloat and was on its way to Halifax. While the ship was sinking to the bottom of the ocean, White Star Line Vice President Philip Franklin said the ship is absolutely unsinkable. He said this while the ship was very much sinking. Newspapers didn't necessarily need all the facts in 1912, but they did try to make up for the misinformation after they learned the truth. On April 16th, The World tried to fix their mistake by running the headline, "No hope now of other Titanic survivors." On April 15th, it didn't take long before the newspaper started running stories that might be labeled distasteful. On April 16th, the Vancouver Province printed an illustration of the Grim Reaper sitting on an iceberg while the Titanic sank beneath the ocean. Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed. USS Lexington. This discovery was made thanks to the help of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and the U.S. Navy. In February of 2018, after searching the Coral Sea, which is about 500 miles off Australia's east coast, divers finally found the remains of the USS Lexington. It was lost while fighting the Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Coral Sea that took place between the 4th and 8th of May 1942. 216 sailors died during the attack, but 2,000 were rescued before it was scuttled by U.S. forces to prevent its secrets from falling into the hands of the enemy after they had incapacitated it. Those who took part in the battle over the 5 days had a major impact in the direction of the war, and it was a defining moment in halting Japanese progression across the Pacific. The wreck was found to be quite well preserved, with 11 of its aircraft still on board, and its discovery was praised by the head of the U.S. Pacific Command because of its historical significance.
No attempts will be made to retrieve it though, because the military considers it a war grave, so it will remain there as a mark of respect. Negro Skeleton. In 2007, cave divers in the Yucatan Peninsula's Hoyo Negro flooded cavern complex discovered the remains of a female human who they named Naya. She was found in a collapsed chamber alongside the remains of 26 large mammals. Most of the animals surrounding Naya went extinct roughly 13,000 years ago. They all likely fell through a sinkhole to the shallow pool 98 feet below, according to paleontologist James Chatters, who led an analysis of the remains. Naya's broken pelvis is evidence of the fall, in contrast to her otherwise pristine remains. This means that this poor girl was most likely out hunting or gathering, fell into the pit, broke her pelvis, and never made it out. Perhaps her family looked for her and never found her. Because divers could not safely recover Naya's entire skeleton from the cave, they traveled back down there and took detailed photographs and measurements of her bones. They determined that she was likely between 15 and 16 years old and stood at about almost 5 feet tall. The divers recovered 2 teeth, a rib, and some mineral deposits that had grown on the surface of her bones. Radiocarbon dating and mitochondrial DNA analysis put Naya's age at between 12,000 and 13,000 years old, and the shape of her skull corroborates the theory that she's at least 10,000 years old. Naya's DNA bears similarities with modern-day Native Americans, who the team's data suggests evolved from Siberian ancestors who crossed over the Bering Land Bridge. While numerous unanswered questions remain, including why Paleo-American skulls display such different morphology from today's Native Americans, Naya's bones run consistent with the idea that people initially inhabited the Americas between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. I-400 class Japanese mega submarine. The Japanese built huge vessels during the war, one of which was the Sentoku-class submarine. At 400 feet long, this was a mega submarine. It even had a hangar in it with room for 3 bombers. This hangar was the defining feature of the I-400, and it was the biggest pre-nuclear submarine ever built. The planes could be catapulted into the air within minutes of the subsurfacing and were a major threat to the U.S. mainland. Ultimately, this ability was never used, and the U.S. Navy managed to capture the I-400. They took it to Pearl Harbor towards the end of the war for inspection, and following the end of hostilities, it was deliberately sunk at sea to prevent the Soviets from learning about it. Records of its whereabouts were lost, but it was found again by chance in 2013, 2,300 feet underwater off the coast of Oahu, Hawaii. Images that have been retrieved showed for the first time the large hangar and even the ship's bell that was torn from the vessel in the explosion that sunk it and lays on the seabed to its side. U.S. pilot from World War II. In 2018, members of the U.S. Armed Forces, coordinated by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA, created an underwater recovery team in an effort to recover personnel lost during World War II. Almost 73,000 Americans remain missing in action from that time. In this particular case, a pilot was shot down over the Pacific, and after several years of research and investigation, the plane and pilot were found near the Republic of Palau. 6 divers pulled daily shifts of over 12 hours for weeks and had to spend a lot of time in the decompression chamber when they surfaced. The aircraft had been untouched for about 74 years. The recovery team completed the mission on February 25th, but won't release the identity of the human remains until it can verify whose they are and notify the next of kin. And now for number 8, but first I wanted to give a quick shout out to Death PS Squad for the super nice comment, and be sure to subscribe if you are new here and click the notification bell if you haven't already. São José Paquete de África. The Slave Wrecks Project, or SWP, is a collaboration of organizations and researchers who search for wrecked slave ships in an effort to humanize the horrific transatlantic slave trade and those who suffered at its hands. This long overlooked yet highly important aspect of global history can also lead to a better understanding of maritime history and African diaspora. There were over 12,000 ships making over 40,000 voyages over 250 years of slave trade, Kamal Sadiki, a lead instructor for diving with a purpose, explained to National Geographic last year. To date, there are only 5 slave ships in maritime history in the database. Why is that? Good question, since scholars estimate that there are thousands of wrecked slave ships along international coastlines. Diving with a purpose is an essential component of SWP's mission. divers with the organization volunteer their time, money, and expertise in assisting with the recovery of wrecked slave vessels. In 2014, SWP recovered the wreck of the Portuguese slave ship São José Paquete de Africa, which ripped in half and sunk between two coral reefs off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa in 1794, killing 212 of the 512 captives on board. The vessel's identification represents one of the first examples of archaeological documentation of a ship that carried human cargo. The discovery was the first of several important contributions SWP has made in reshaping our understanding of the past and of the slave trade. Artifacts from the wreck are currently on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. A sunken train graveyard. Off the coast of Long Branch, New Jersey, two rare train locomotives that were lost during the 1850s lie preserved under 90 feet of water. A scuba diver named Paul Hepler discovered them completely by chance in 1985 while using a magnetometer to map the sea floor. The device detected two huge metal objects. He didn't know what they were at first because the visibility was terrible. What were these dark metal objects? When he went on more dives through the murky water, he realized that they were actually locomotives. Experts determined that they are a rare model known as a Planet Class 222T, which was essentially obsolete practically by the time it went into production, so it wasn't made for very long. The 15-ton self-contained locomotives were simply too small for their time, when other steam engines weighed around 35 tons on average, and it seems as though the two that ended up submerged in the Atlantic never went into service anyway. There are no records of the sunken trains being lost or even produced, leaving researchers pretty confused about how they ended up at the bottom of the ocean. It's possible that records once existed but were also lost or destroyed, or that there were never any records to begin with. Experts theorize that the engines were being transported on a barge from Boston to the mid-Atlantic region and encountered a storm 5 miles off the New Jersey coast, causing them to either fall off the ship, or maybe they were even deliberately pushed into the water to lighten the load and prevent it from sinking. Dan Lieb, a member of the Philadelphia chapter of the Explorers Club, said that it looks like they were steaming across the bottom in a race. Despite the rust and barnacles, they look in pretty good shape. New Jersey Museum of Transportation is debating on whether or not to bring them up and have them restored, or to leave them at the bottom of the sea. Mexico's flooded caves. When a large asteroid collided with Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, it created a 124-mile-wide crater in the Earth's surface and sparked an ensuing mega tsunami. How big was this asteroid to cause such destruction? 9.3 miles wide, about twice as long as the Las Vegas Strip, or about 2.5 times taller than Mount Kilimanjaro. Over time, the resulting thousands of limestone sinkholes collapsed and eroded, forming vast underwater cave networks known as cenotes. In 2012, cave divers were doing some exploring when they came across some disturbing remains. They found a skull and lots of bones, which they then posted on social media. The nearly complete skeleton may be one of the oldest ever found in the Americas. Located in a cave called Chan Hole near Tulum, by the time archaeologists Arturo González González and Jerónimo Áviles Holguín reached the submerged site, most of the remains were gone. Someone had gotten there first and stolen the skeleton. The only thing they left behind was a shard of hip bone because it was embedded into the stalagmite. Luckily, the remaining shards of bone provided enough evidence for experts to determine their age. By analyzing the rate of calcite formation around the bone, they concluded that the skeleton was at least 13,000 years old. It belonged to a young man who died when the caves were still above ground. This was just one of several fascinating discoveries within the yet largely unexplored cenotes. In August of last year, a team of researchers consisting of scuba divers, photographers, archaeologists, and computer graphics experts announced plans to capture the interiors of dozens of cenotes in the form of 3D visuals. Known as the Wonderland Project, the images will enable people to virtually explore caves that have never been publicly accessible from the comfort of their homes. The cenotes are suspected to contain everything from fossil bones to ancient Maya artifacts. Divers are mostly leaving the artifacts themselves untouched, as they don't want to disturb ancient and sacred sites. Some objects are too delicate to be moved or even touched, making the project all the more invaluable by preserving items that may otherwise be lost to time. World War II plane. One of the sad truths about war is that not everyone makes it home, but what's even worse in some ways are the people who go missing in action. In World War II, an F-4U-4 Corsair fighter bomber piloted by U.S. Marine Second Lieutenant John McGrath was reported missing in July 1945 after a rocket attack at Iriomote-jima. Diver and researcher Justin Talon runs the website called Pacific Wrecks, a nonprofit organization that searches for World War II crash sites. He and a friend spent 2 years looking for this wrecked aircraft. The missing pilot was a high school friend of his father's from New York, so Talon had a personal connection to the missing pilot and wanted to help find out what had happened to him. It was a cold case, but locals from the island of Iriomote told stories of the crashed airplane in the water. They said that they had been praying for the lost pilot. Someone had already visited the wreck and removed the human remains from the plane in the 1980s, but they were never attributed to McGrath for some very strange reason. When Talon put on his gear, went below the water, and saw the remains of the wartime aircraft, he said he was finally able to have closure and tell McGrath's family where he was. W.C. Kimble. Last November, shipwreck hunters and divers announced the discovery of the W.C. Kimble, a 40-ton wooden schooner lost in an 1891 gale with 4 people aboard in northern Lake Michigan. The wreckage was found 300 feet below the water's surface and is perhaps the world's most intact 19th century wooden schooner ever found. The W.C. Kimble was built in Wisconsin and spent her entire life on Lake Michigan. Shipwreck hunter and author Ross Richardson, who made the initial discovery in 2018, noticed a small blip on his sonar while sailing across the northern portion of the lake. He eventually returned to the site with a technical diver and underwater photographer. The schooner contained no identifying marks despite its pristine condition. As a result, the process of identifying the wreck was complex and lengthy. Richardson spent 3 weeks poring over 6,000 schooner records before finally matching the W.C. Kimble as the most likely vessel among about a dozen candidates. Upon closer examination, the researchers noticed that the vessel's lifeboat was still attached, meaning that it was never used by the crew. This chilling fact implies that the crew had already gone overboard and perished by the time the W.C. Kimble sank. The world's largest cave. In April 2019, 3 divers who had already made worldwide headlines the year before for heroically rescuing a Thai soccer team and their coach from a cave made yet another internationally recognized breakthrough. Isn't that amazing? The divers, Rick Stanton, Jason Mallinson, and Chris Jewell, were invited to descend into central Vietnam's Son Doong Cave. They entered an unexplored, waterlogged pit that many believe connects to other chambers. If this is in fact the case, it means Son Doong is easily the largest cave in the world, and it would never be overtaken, according to the British cave expert Howard Limbert. The divers believe the chamber could be 394 feet deep, but they were pushed back at 252 feet due to a lack of oxygen. Their next step is to return to Vietnam this year and hopefully connect the tunnel to a nearby cave. Son Doong is already so vast, it boasts its own ecosystem and weather patterns. A local forager first discovered it in 1991, but it thereafter fell back into obscurity for another 19 years due to its entrance being covered by thick foliage. Several caves, including Son Doong, are located within Vietnam's Phong Nha National Park, of which less than 30% has been thoroughly explored. The Clotilda. In 2019, as the transatlantic slave trade reached its 400th anniversary, SWP announced the discovery of the last known slave ship to arrive in the United States, the Clotilda. The find resulted from a collaborative effort between the SWP, the Alabama Historical Commission, and an organization called Search Inc., which specializes in maritime archaeology. Rumors swirled about the ship's existence for decades, but remained unproven until it was located just north of the Mobile Bay Delta in Alabama. While the water wasn't very deep, the conditions were treacherous and visibility was almost zero. In 1856, the Clotilda transported 110 African captives from what is now the country of Benin to Alabama. Following the ship's arrival to the U.S., Captain William Foster ordered for it to be burned and sunk to conceal evidence of participation in the slave trade, which the U.S. officially banned in 1808. Included among the captives aboard the Clotilda was Charlie Lewis, the great-great-grandfather of 71-year-old Lorna Gale Woods, who trembled with emotion following the discovery. Woods' family kept their heritage alive by passing down stories of how their predecessors were ripped from their homeland against their will. After the Civil War, survivors of the Clotilda wanted to return to Africa but couldn't afford to. Instead, they pooled their money together and formed a settlement north of Mobile called Africatown. Descendants of the founders of Africatown helped spark the movement to find the sunken vessel. While plans regarding the Clotilda's remains are up in the air, the discovery is without question an invaluable historical and cultural resource. It's important to remember even the darkest periods of the past. Naora. Last June, after 3 years of research and plenty of advice from local fishermen, diver Steve Saville discovered the 102-year-old remains of a shipwreck off the southern Australia coast that claimed 14 lives. The steam tug Naora went down on July 9, 1917, during a severe storm 31 miles off Cape Jaffa while towing the Astoria, an American 4-masted sailing ship. Naora began listing in the heavy seas, causing the crew to cut the tow line in an attempt to save both themselves and the crew of the Astoria. Unfortunately, the tug sank as waves smashed into its engine room door. Only 2 crew members clung to the top of a wrecked lifeboat and survived. Meanwhile, 14 others tragically succumbed to the disaster. The 2 survivors managed to paddle to Margaret Brock Reef Lighthouse overnight and were pulled to shore by lightkeepers who bravely rowed into the tempestuous sea. Following the ordeal, the lighthouse keepers were rewarded for their bravery with medals. Today, the Naora sits 164 feet below the water's surface as a once-forgotten testament to its service. The Naora was a popular tug of Port Melbourne and would be called upon to solve all sorts of shipping problems around Australia, Saville told 9 News. Descendants of both the Naora survivors and one of the lighthouse keepers who participated in their rescue were informed of the discovery. Thanks for watching! Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on the latest videos. See you later! Bye!